In the heart of a bustling town courthouse, tension hung in the air as people packed the seats, leaning forward in anticipation of what was to come. It was a case that had drawn significant attention, not only for the stakes involved, but for the personalities in the room. At the defense table sat a man infamous for his arrogance and pride, a high-profile lawyer named Richard who had recently arrived from a prestigious firm in a larger city. Known for his brash tactics and ruthless demeanor, he carried with him an air of entitlement that was almost tangible, making those around him feel lesser just by his presence. He was a man who relished control and power, confident in his ability to dismantle anyone who stood in his way. But today was different. Today, the person he was facing wasn't someone who would back down easily. She was a local judge, renowned for her calm authority and deep compassion, especially for marginalized voices. A black woman of unwavering conviction, she held herself with dignity, commanding respect without ever needing to raise her voice. The two were set on a collision course, and everyone in the courtroom could sense that this was about to be a showdown like no other. As the judge entered the courtroom, there was a hush among the spectators. She glanced around the room, acknowledging the community members who had come out to witness what many hoped would be a reckoning. There was something powerful in her eyes, a fire that suggested she was prepared for whatever Richard would throw her way. She took her seat, adjusted her robe, and met Richard's gaze with a steady, unwavering stare. Richard, clearly irked by her confidence, scoffed audibly, giving a dismissive smirk that hinted at the disdain he felt for her and the entire proceedings. He leaned over to his assistant, murmuring just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Small-town judges, they think they're so high and mighty. Let's just get this over with. This isn't a real court case, it's a joke." His voice dripped with condescension, and a few people nearby shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. The judge noticed, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her notes, her focus razor-sharp. As the proceedings began, Richard immediately launched into his arguments, his voice booming with practiced authority. His tone was harsh, laced with thinly veiled disdain, and as he spoke, it became clear that he wasn't just challenging the case, but taking the opportunity to belittle and insult anyone he perceived as beneath him. Every word seemed designed to put people down, from witnesses to the judge herself, as though he believed that intimidation was his greatest weapon. His confidence grew with each sentence, his eyes flicking toward the judge occasionally, as if daring her to react. But the judge sat still, her expression a perfect mask of neutrality. She allowed him to speak, to dig himself deeper with each scornful word. Her silence seemed to unsettle him, and as he spoke, he became more aggressive, as though hoping to crack her resolve. At one point, he leaned forward, pointing a finger in her direction, his voice loud and booming. "This whole case is laughable. I expected a real judge, someone with experience and professionalism. Not." He paused, his lips curling into a sneer. "Someone playing dress-up." The courtroom gasped. His words hung in the air, heavy with the implication of disrespect, not just for her position, but for who she was. It was a blatant, unmistakable insult, and everyone in the room could feel the undercurrent of racism in his words. The judge took a deep breath, her hands folding neatly in front of her, and she leaned forward, her gaze steady as a rock. "Mr. Richard," she said, her voice low but incredibly powerful, "do you believe your behavior here today is appropriate for a court of law?" Her question cut through the air like a knife, quiet but commanding. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Richard's eyes, a brief moment where he realized he may have gone too far. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "Oh, I apologize," he said sarcastically, smirking again. "I wasn't aware this courtroom had such high standards." He looked around, rolling his eyes, and a few people in the audience murmured in discomfort. He seemed to relish the tension, feeling he'd won whatever unspoken battle he was waging. But the judge wasn't done. She straightened her back, her eyes never leaving his. "Mr. Richard, it's important to remember that respect is a two-way street. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." There was a moment of stunned silence. Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the steely edge in her voice. He shifted uncomfortably, but quickly masked it with a forced laugh, brushing off her words as though they didn't matter. "Well, if that's the case," he said with mock politeness, "I'll be sure to be extra respectful from here on out." His voice was dripping with sarcasm, and he leaned back, clearly feeling victorious. The judge let him continue, not interrupting as he rambled on, presenting his case with increasing arrogance. But there was a shift in the air. The spectators could feel it. This wasn't going to end the way Richard thought it would. The judge listened intently, never once interrupting, her calm demeanor only adding to the anticipation building in the room. And when it was finally her turn to speak, she did so with a measured grace that completely contrasted his bluster. "Thank you, Mr. Richard," she began, her voice soft yet firm. "I appreciate your thorough presentation." She paused, letting the silence settle. "However, I would like to remind you that the purpose of this courtroom is to serve justice fairly, impartially, and with respect for all involved, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." Her words struck a chord, echoing in the room with a sense of finality. Richard's smirk began to falter as he realized that the judge was not merely offering a polite rebuke. She was asserting her authority in a way that he could no longer ignore. She proceeded to address each of his arguments with surgical precision, calmly dismantling his points one by one, exposing the flaws in his logic, and highlighting the weak foundations upon which he had built his case. As she spoke, Richard's bravado visibly crumbled. His face turned pale, his hands clutching the edge of the table. He stammered, trying to interrupt, but the judge simply raised her hand, silencing him without raising her voice. The power dynamics had completely shifted, and everyone in the room could see it. By the time she was done, there was no doubt in anyone's mind who held the true authority in the courtroom. Richard was left speechless, his arrogance shattered, as the weight of his own actions came crashing down around him. For once, he had nothing to say, no clever retort, no sarcastic quip. He had met his match, and the realization hit him harder than any legal defeat he'd ever faced. As the judge concluded her response, she looked him directly in the eyes and said, "This courtroom is a place of integrity, and integrity does not bow to arrogance or prejudice. Remember that." Her words were like a final blow, sealing his fate in front of the community he had tried to belittle. And with that, she adjourned the session, leaving him to sit there, stripped of his pride, and humbled in a way he had never imagined. The spectators rose to their feet, applauding, cheering, and some even wiping away tears. For them, this wasn't just about one man's arrogance being put in its place. It was a powerful moment of justice, a reminder that respect and dignity could triumph over prejudice. As they filed out of the courtroom, there was a palpable sense of unity and pride among them, a feeling that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. For Richard, however, the moment marked the beginning of a humbling journey he would never forget. And as he sat there, alone in the emptying courtroom, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, leaving him to ponder the consequences of his arrogance. The judge had indeed given him instant justice, in a way he would feel for a long time to come. In the quiet aftermath of the explosive courtroom encounter, word quickly spread across the small town. It was all anyone could talk about: how a prominent out-of-town lawyer had been publicly put in his place by the local judge. People recounted the details with fascination, each retelling adding more color to the story. For the townsfolk, this was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a reminder of the strength of their community and the values they held dear. But to truly understand the impact, one would have to go back and learn more about the individuals at the center of it all. The town was a close-knit community, a place where people still greeted each other by name on the street, and where the history ran as deep as the rivers surrounding it. For generations, it had been a blend of hardworking people who prided themselves on resilience and unity, with a particular focus on embracing diversity. This sense of unity had only strengthened in recent years as they faced challenges from the outside, from big corporations trying to buy out local businesses to discriminatory practices that had no place in their town. And at the heart of these battles was Judge Maya Brooks, a woman whose quiet strength had inspired countless people. Maya was not from a wealthy background. She had grown up in this very town, working her way through school with the help of scholarships, part-time jobs, and the unwavering support of her family and neighbors. She had always been someone who saw the good in people, who fought for justice not out of a sense of duty, but from a genuine desire to make a difference. In a profession where many people became hardened, Maya retained her empathy and compassion, which only made her stronger. She became known as someone who gave everyone a fair chance, no matter their background, and she had a particular sensitivity toward cases involving marginalized communities. Over the years, Maya had built a strong reputation within the town and beyond. People traveled from surrounding areas to see her preside over cases, knowing that she would bring a sense of integrity and fairness to every judgment. Her courtroom was a place where justice truly felt within reach for everyone. But with this respect also came challenges. Many outsiders, particularly those who came from wealth or privilege, often underestimated her, viewing her as just another small-town figure without real power. This was something she had faced throughout her career, and though it was exhausting, she had learned to use it to her advantage, surprising those who doubted her with the depth of her intellect and strength of her convictions. Richard Crane, the lawyer who had recently stormed into town, was the embodiment of this arrogance and entitlement. A man who saw himself as above the norms and customs of small communities, he had arrived in town with little regard for its people. He was an outsider, but more than that, he was someone who seemed almost allergic to humility. Richard had grown up in a world of privilege, where his talent as a lawyer had been nurtured and honed, not to fight for justice, but to exploit loopholes, manipulate outcomes, and win by any means necessary. To him, the courtroom was not a place of truth and fairness. It was a battlefield, a place to dominate and conquer. Richard's entry into town had been anything but subtle. He made his presence known immediately, flaunting his expensive suits, luxury car, and a blatant disregard for the local customs. He'd barely been in town a week before he began making enemies. It started with the small things, brushing off the local shopkeepers, making snide remarks about the town's lack of sophistication, and scoffing at the community's deep-rooted values. But things escalated when he started taking on cases against small businesses, often intimidating owners into settlements they couldn't afford. His approach was ruthless, and the townspeople quickly grew to resent him. Then there was the incident at the local diner, a humble establishment that had been run by the same family for 3 generations. Richard had walked in, ordered coffee, and upon seeing the owner, a black man in his 60s who was beloved by the community, he made a remark loud enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't realize they allowed just anyone to own a place like this," he sneered, not even bothering to hide his disdain. The diner fell silent as everyone processed his words, shocked that someone could be so openly condescending and disrespectful. The owner, a gentleman named Samuel, simply smiled, his face filled with both hurt and resilience, as he calmly refilled Richard's coffee without a word. It was a moment that everyone present would remember, a moment that marked Richard as a villain in the eyes of the community. Despite his behavior, Richard didn't seem to notice or care about the growing animosity around him. In fact, he seemed to feed off it, enjoying the power he wielded over the people who dared to challenge him. And this attitude only intensified when he took on a case that put him directly at odds with Judge Maya Brooks. The case was complex and involved a local nonprofit organization that provided resources and support to the town's underprivileged youth. The organization was beloved by the community, a beacon of hope for many families, and the town had rallied behind it since its inception. Richard's client, however, was a wealthy businessman who wanted to buy the land on which the nonprofit's main center was built. His plan was to turn it into a high-end development, a move that would displace countless families and strip the community of a vital resource. For the townspeople, this was not just a legal case, it was a fight for their values and their future. When Mina was assigned to preside over the case, it felt like a glimmer of hope, a chance to protect what they held dear. But Richard saw this as an opportunity to further assert his dominance. He viewed Maya as yet another small-town figure who he could easily overpower. To him, she was just another obstacle in his way, someone who lacked the sophistication and resources to stand up to his big city tactics. He didn't bother learning her background or understanding her connection to the community. In his mind, he had already won the case. The idea that this judge could challenge him was laughable to him. On the day of their first court session, Richard strutted into the courthouse with his usual arrogance, hardly bothering to acknowledge the people around him. He noticed Maya as he walked into the courtroom, but he barely registered her as anything more than another insignificant figure in his world. As he prepared his case, he felt nothing but confidence, convinced that his polished arguments and well-rehearsed theatrics would easily secure him a victory. However, as the session began, he quickly realized that Maya was not someone to be underestimated. She listened to him with a level of attentiveness that he found unnerving, her expression unreadable as he presented his arguments. She allowed him to speak without interruption, her gaze steady and unflinching. And as the minutes ticked by, he began to feel an unusual sensation, something he had rarely experienced in his career: doubt. The townspeople watched closely, sensing that something significant was unfolding before their eyes. They knew Maya, and they knew that her silence was not a sign of weakness. In fact, it was her way of allowing Richard to reveal his true colors, to expose the flaws in his own arguments. She didn't need to raise her voice or challenge him directly. She only needed to wait, and eventually he would stumble. And stumble he did. As he grew more frustrated by her calm demeanor, he became increasingly aggressive, lacing his arguments with condescension and disrespect. At one point, he even addressed her in a patronizing tone, as though she were a novice who didn't understand the complexities of the law. The townspeople bristled at his tone, but Maya remained composed, her gaze never wavering. It was then that Richard made his fatal mistake. Frustrated by her silence, he let his guard down and allowed his true feelings to slip through. He looked at her with a sneer and said, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I expected a more sophisticated approach. I didn't think I'd be dealing with such small-town tactics." His words dripped with contempt, his disdain for her and for the community he was in laid bare for all to see. The room fell silent, and Richard seemed to realize too late that he had gone too far. Maya remained still, her expression calm but her eyes flashing with an intensity that made even the most confident spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. In that moment, she became a symbol of everything the community stood for: strength, dignity, and resilience in the face of prejudice. And as she finally spoke, addressing him with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt, it was clear to everyone present that Richard had miscalculated. He had underestimated her, the community, and the values that bound them together. With each statement, Richard grew paler, his hands beginning to tremble as he scrambled through his notes, searching for a counterargument. But Maya wasn't giving him any room to breathe. She continued, "And as for your earlier comments on small-town tactics, I find it ironic, Mr. Crane, that someone so eager to belittle this community would lack the foresight to fully comprehend its strength and resilience. The people of this town are not naive, nor are they easily intimidated. They understand the value of fairness, integrity, and respect. Values that I have yet to see reflected in your actions here today." The crowd, though still silent, was visibly engaged, their expressions showing a mix of pride, admiration, and sheer satisfaction as they watched Maya skillfully defend not only the legal aspects of the case, but the town's core values. She was, in essence, giving voice to every person in the room who had ever felt belittled or disrespected by someone like Richard. This wasn't just a legal showdown. It was a stand against the kind of prejudice and elitism that had no place in their lives. Richard, realizing he was cornered, tried to interrupt, sputtering, "Your Honor, I believe this line off. But Maya didn't let him finish. She held up a hand, her voice even but commanding. "Mr. Crane, you've had your turn. Now, allow me to finish." Her words were like a hammer striking down, final and absolute, leaving Richard to sit in silence, fuming but powerless. There was no escape from the reality that he had underestimated her. And worse, he had underestimated the community she represented. As Maya continued to dismantle his case, the weight of her words pressed down on Richard, exposing the empty bravado beneath his arrogance. He had come into this town thinking he could control the narrative, that he could impose his will on people he considered inferior. But now he was faced with a harsh truth. In this courtroom, his wealth and status meant nothing. What mattered here was justice, something he had forgotten along the way. The longer Maya spoke, the more the crowd felt that something monumental was happening. This was a turning point, not just in this case, but for the town as a whole. They were witnessing their values being defended with a dignity and strength that made them feel prouder than ever to call this place home. And in that moment, Judge Maya Brooks was not just a judge. She was a beacon of hope, a protector of everything they held dear. Richard, for the first time in his career, felt truly defeated. His confidence had been stripped away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and painfully aware of his own shortcomings. And though his pride resisted, he knew deep down that he had been bested. He had underestimated a woman he thought of as inconsequential, and he had underestimated a community that would not back down. In his world, money and power were supposed to guarantee success. But here, in this small town, something far more powerful had prevailed. As Maya finally concluded her remarks, she delivered a final statement that would echo through the courtroom long after the case was closed. "Let this serve as a reminder, Mr. Crane," she said, her gaze piercing, "that respect is not something you can demand with a title or a degree. It is something you earn through your actions. And in this town, respect is the highest currency we hold." Her words hung in the air, filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver through the room. The crowd erupted into applause, breaking the usual decorum of the courtroom, but unable to contain their appreciation. People rose to their feet, some even wiping away tears, overwhelmed by the pride and solidarity they felt in that moment. Richard sat there, stunned, as he watched the crowd stand behind Maya, their support an undeniable show of unity against everything he represented. In the days that followed, Richard's reputation in the town was irreparably damaged. His clients pulled their support, realizing they could no longer rely on someone so out of touch with the community's values. He tried to salvage his career, even attempted to apologize publicly, but it was too late. The town had seen his true nature, and they would never forget. And though he eventually left, defeated and humiliated, his legacy remained. A cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and prejudice, and a reminder that some battles are won not with money or power, but with integrity and respect. As for Judge Maya Brooks, she became more than just a respected figure. She became a legend within the town. People told stories of her strength, of the way she had stood up for them when it mattered most, and how she had reminded them all of the values that made their community unique. In that single courtroom battle, she had not only defended justice, but had fortified the bonds that held the town together. And long after the courtroom had emptied, her words lingered in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been there to witness the showdown. They served as a guiding light, a reminder that no matter how small or humble a place might seem, its strength lay in the integrity of its people. And as they carried on with their lives, they did so with the unshakable knowledge that they had a protector in Judge Maya Brooks, someone who would always stand for what was right. The impact of the courtroom showdown spread through the town like wildfire. Richard Crane's disgraceful departure from the courtroom had become a rallying cry for the community, a tale that was recounted over coffee in local diners, whispered in small-town barbershops, and echoed in conversations at family gatherings. People spoke of it as a moment of pride, not just because a corrupt and condescending outsider had been humbled, but because Judge Maya Brooks had stood up for the very principles that bound them all together. It was a victory for decency, justice, and respect, values that had always been at the core of their community. Yet, as with any significant event, the repercussions of that day didn't end when the gavel came down. The fallout was far-reaching, affecting everyone from the local business owners to the most powerful elites in the nearby city. For Richard, the immediate consequences were brutal. As he left town, the weight of his humiliation was apparent. He walked to his car under the eyes of the townsfolk, who watched him with a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and disdain. His former arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by a haunted look of defeat. He'd come to this town believing that his wealth, his education, and his connections made him untouchable, but he was leaving with the bitter knowledge that none of those things had saved him from the judgment of an honest community and a relentless judge. Back in the city, word of his courtroom embarrassment reached his firm before he even arrived. The managing partners, wary of the firm's reputation, were less than pleased by his conduct. It wasn't simply that he had lost the case, but the manner in which he'd done so. News had reached them of his arrogant, borderline racist behavior, and the backlash from the town had only added fuel to the fire. Richard found himself summoned to a closed-door meeting with the firm's senior partners, who made it clear that his behavior was not only unprofessional, but had cast a shadow over the firm's name. This firm, one of the partners had said in a low, measured voice, cannot afford to employ someone who treats clients and communities with such blatant disrespect. Facing potential suspension, or worse, termination, Richard was forced to confront the reality of his situation. His charm and prestige, once his greatest assets, now seemed hollow. People who had once catered to him now avoided his calls. His colleagues exchanged whispers as he passed, and his own clients began to question his judgment. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the fallout of his arrogance wasn't limited to his career. It was seeping into every corner of his life. Alone in his apartment, Richard tried to rationalize his actions, to convince himself that he'd simply been misunderstood. But even his reflection offered no comfort. Deep down, he knew that he had been wrong, not just legally but morally. The arrogance that had fueled his success was now the very thing unraveling his life. Meanwhile, in the town, Judge Maya Brooks found herself a symbol of hope and strength. Her life had always been dedicated to the community, but now she was seen as a guardian, someone who stood up for them when it mattered most. She had become more than just a judge. She was the embodiment of the values that they held dear. The impact of her actions went far beyond the courtroom. Community leaders, inspired by her example, began to push for more stringent measures to protect local businesses and preserve the town's unique character. They formed committees, held town hall meetings, and even raised funds to create grants and programs to support small business owners and local entrepreneurs. What had begun as a legal case had sparked a movement. Maya's actions also inspired a renewed commitment to equity and inclusion within the town. Local educators began organizing discussions around topics of respect, tolerance, and justice, using the courtroom event as a real-world lesson for students. Community leaders invited Maya to speak at these gatherings, hoping to share her story with young minds who would one day become the town's leaders. Each time she spoke, Maya emphasized that her actions were not extraordinary, that anyone could stand up for justice if they approached it with courage and integrity. She wanted people to see that standing against prejudice and arrogance wasn't limited to judges or lawyers. It was a duty they all shared. Even Samuel, the owner of the town's beloved diner and one of the first people Richard had openly insulted, felt the effects of the incident in surprising ways. After Maya's victory in court, people began to rally around him, showing their support by frequenting his diner more often, leaving generous tips, and expressing their gratitude for his quiet resilience. The diner, once a humble establishment, soon became a place where people gathered to celebrate the community's resilience. Samuel, who had weathered the humiliation of Richard's sneers with grace, became something of a local hero himself. People saw in him a strength that complemented Maya's, a quiet but steadfast dignity that showed how powerful unity could be against divisiveness. As the months passed, Richard's downfall became a story that rippled outward, beyond the town and into the city's legal circles. Other communities heard of what had happened, and soon Maya's actions were discussed in professional networks, even drawing the attention of legal reform advocates. Maya received invitations to speak at legal conferences and community events across the region, where people were eager to hear how she had used her position to uphold justice in a way that resonated far beyond her small courtroom. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome was how the event affected Richard himself. Shunned by his firm and abandoned by his former friends, he found himself forced to confront his own behavior. For weeks, he struggled with anger and resentment, refusing to take responsibility and blaming everyone but himself. But over time, as his anger cooled and his isolation deepened, a sense of introspection began to creep in. He began to see how his arrogance had isolated him, how his relentless ambition had stripped him of empathy and compassion. He started visiting local clinics and community centers, observing the people he had once dismissed as small-town nobodies, and seeing, for the first time, the strength and kindness that filled their lives. One day, almost a year after that fateful case, Richard found himself back in the town he had once looked down upon. This time, however, he was not here to represent a wealthy client or intimidate local business owners. He had come on his own, quietly, with no entourage, no fancy car, no suit. In jeans and a simple jacket, he walked the familiar streets, humbled and reflective. He wandered into Samuel's diner, feeling the weight of the past settle around him. He ordered a cup of coffee and, after a moment's hesitation, approached Samuel himself. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice subdued, "for the things I said, the way I treated you. I was wrong, and I didn't see it back then, but I do now." Samuel looked at him, his face a mixture of surprise and understanding. There was a long silence before he nodded, his usual calm demeanor unfazed but softened by an almost paternal warmth. "Takes courage to admit when you're wrong," Samuel replied, extending a hand. "It's never too late to start doing things right." Word of Richard's visit spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Judge Maya Brooks heard about it. She, too, was surprised but recognized the transformation he had undergone. He had returned to the town seeking redemption, not for accolades or recognition, but out of a genuine desire to make amends. Maya had always believed in the potential for people to change, but seeing it in someone as unlikely as Richard Crane was a profound affirmation of her faith in humanity. A few days after his visit to the diner, Richard requested to meet with her, and Maya agreed. When he walked into her office, Richard looked like a different man, humble, remorseful, and visibly nervous. He spoke to her candidly, expressing his gratitude for the lesson she had taught him, and admitting that it had taken losing everything for him to see the error of his ways. Maya listened patiently, offering him the same respect she extended to everyone in her courtroom. When he finished, she looked at him thoughtfully and said, "Mr. Crane, I believe in justice, but I also believe in redemption. It takes strength to acknowledge one's mistakes, and it takes even more to make things right." The two spoke for a long time, discussing not only his journey but the values he had learned to appreciate. Maya saw in him a genuine desire to change, a humility that had replaced his former arrogance. And though she did not forget the pain he had caused, she was willing to offer him a second chance, provided he used it to help others. It was an opportunity that Richard did not take lightly. In the months that followed, he began offering his legal services pro bono to people in underserved communities, fighting for the very people he had once dismissed. His transformation became a quiet but powerful testament to the town's strength, a reminder that even the hardest of hearts could be softened with time, humility, and the willingness to change. And while Richard Crane would never be hailed as a hero, his journey became a story of growth and redemption, illustrating that justice, at its core, is about giving people the chance to be better. For the town, the memory of that fateful day in the courtroom remained a symbol of resilience. Judge Maya Brooks continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her actions had not only protected her community but had sparked a ripple effect of change. And the townspeople, from Samuel to the young students who had watched with wide eyes and open hearts, carried the lesson with them. A reminder that standing up for justice and integrity has the power to transform not just a case but lives. As news of Richard's transformation spread through the town, people were taken aback. It was almost surreal for those who had once witnessed his arrogant tirade in the courtroom to now see him humbly assisting those he had previously looked down upon. For some, it took time to believe he was sincere. Could a man so deeply embedded in his prejudices and entitled arrogance really change? The whispers around town reflected a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. Yet, as the months wore on, and Richard continued his quiet, consistent efforts to make amends, something unexpected happened. The community began to open up to him. Richard had gone from representing high-profile clients to providing legal aid to everyday people in the town. His transformation wasn't publicized. He didn't do interviews or seek accolades. He simply showed up, day after day, working with a humility that surprised those who encountered him. From assisting small business owners facing legal issues to helping families with housing disputes, he threw himself into cases that held no glamour or prestige, but which affected real people's lives in significant ways. It was as if he was trying to chip away at his old self, hoping that each small act of kindness and service could somehow redeem the man he had once been. In a way, his actions had a ripple effect on the community. For years, the people of the town had quietly endured subtle and overt forms of discrimination from outsiders who, like Richard, had perceived them as inferior or backward. Many had experienced the sting of judgment from people who didn't understand their way of life, who didn't see the strength and beauty in their close-knit bonds and shared values. Richard's change of heart reminded them that even the most unlikely individuals could come to appreciate and respect their world. One of the people most touched by his transformation was Samuel, the diner owner. For months, Richard would come by the diner each morning, ordering a simple coffee and exchanging polite nods with Samuel. Their initial interactions were sparse, a simple exchange of coffee and quiet words. But slowly, something deeper began to build between them. Samuel, a man of few words but profound insight, sensed Richard's inner struggle, the way he carried the weight of his guilt like a scar he couldn't hide. Samuel, who had endured Richard's worst behavior without losing his calm dignity, began to see Richard not as the arrogant lawyer from before, but as a man trying to atone for his past. One evening, Samuel found himself sitting across from Richard after the diner had closed. The two men spoke at length, their conversation turning to life, redemption, and second chances. Samuel shared his own story, recounting the struggles he had faced as a young black man trying to establish his business, the quiet perseverance that had kept him going despite the prejudice he had endured. Listening to Samuel, Richard felt a wave of humility and respect that he had never known before. For the first time, he understood what it meant to endure, to persevere with dignity in the face of adversity. By the end of the conversation, the two men shared a mutual understanding, a bridge of respect that spoke louder than words. Samuel's quiet forgiveness and Richard's unspoken gratitude became a cornerstone of his journey, a reminder of the man he wanted to become. Meanwhile, Judge Maya Brooks watched Richard's transformation from a distance, observing his progress with a mixture of hope and caution. She had always believed in justice tempered by compassion, in the power of giving people a second chance if they showed a willingness to change. Yet, she remained mindful of her role as a judge, knowing that her support for Richard's redemption could never overshadow her commitment to fairness. She knew that redemption was a path that could not be hurried, that true change took time, and would be measured by actions, not words. And so, she quietly encouraged him by allowing him to contribute to community projects, especially those aimed at supporting underprivileged youth and families. One day, Maya invited Richard to attend a community event held in honor of the town's youth empowerment program. It was the very program that he had once tried to dismantle, and the irony was not lost on him. Standing before a crowd that still remembered his arrogance, Richard felt a pang of shame. Yet he also felt gratitude, for Maya's invitation was a gesture of trust, an opportunity to show his commitment. During the event, he quietly helped set up, assisting with minor tasks, staying in the background. He didn't seek recognition, nor did he try to ingratiate himself. He was simply there, another hand offering support to the community he had once looked down upon. Throughout the evening, he was struck by the warmth and resilience of the people around him. He watched as Maya spoke to the young people, her voice filled with encouragement, her words a beacon of hope for the next generation. She spoke of courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Richard listened, hanging on to every word, realizing that these were the very qualities he had once lacked. He saw in the faces of the youth a reflection of the community's spirit, and it dawned on him that he was witnessing the true strength of the town. It wasn't found in wealth or power, but in the character of its people, in their unity and resolve to uplift each other. As the event drew to a close, Maya approached him, her expression calm but her eyes holding a glimmer of approval. "You're beginning to understand," she said, her voice low but kind. "This town doesn't ask for perfection, Richard. It only asks that people treat each other with respect and compassion." Her words resonated deeply, and Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future that honored those he had wronged. In the weeks that followed, Richard continued to immerse himself in the town's activities. He started volunteering at local schools, speaking to students about his mistakes and the importance of empathy and humility. His story became a powerful lesson for the youth, a reminder that people could change, that even the most hardened hearts could learn to soften. His vulnerability, his willingness to admit his past failures, inspired many students who had struggled with issues of self-worth and resilience. Richard's journey became a source of hope, a living example of transformation, and a testament to the town's values. Eventually, the people of the town began to embrace him, not as a former antagonist, but as someone who had learned, grown, and joined their community in a meaningful way. Though he would never be a hero in their eyes, they saw in him a man who had confronted his flaws and chosen to live differently. Maya continued to offer quiet support, her faith in his journey unwavering, and Samuel remained a steadfast friend, offering wisdom and counsel when Richard needed it most. Over time, Richard found himself more connected to the town than he had ever been to the places he had previously called home. He had found not just redemption, but a community that valued him for who he was becoming. Richard's story was shared beyond the town, reaching legal circles and even becoming a topic at several legal conferences where Maya spoke on the importance of community-centered justice. It sparked discussions on the need for humility within the legal profession, reminding lawyers that their work wasn't about winning at all costs, but about serving the communities they represented. Maya's message resonated widely, inspiring a new generation of legal professionals to approach their work with empathy and a commitment to equity. As for Richard, he never forgot the lessons he had learned in that courtroom or the dignity with which Maya and Samuel had treated him, even when he had not deserved it. He dedicated his life to service, spending his career fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, determined to use his skills for good. In the end, the transformation he underwent wasn't just a redemption arc. It was a complete reimagining of who he was, a commitment to live with purpose and respect for the values that the town had taught him. Years later, as he looked back on his journey, Richard often thought of the small-town courtroom, of Judge Maya Brooks, who had seen potential in him when no one else had. He remembered Samuel's calm resilience and the unwavering support of a community that had given him a second chance. And though he knew he could never fully undo his past, he found peace in the life he had built, a life dedicated to giving back to the town that had shown him the true meaning of justice, humility, and belonging. Years passed, and Richard Crane's life continued to evolve in ways he never could have foreseen. His story had become somewhat legendary in the small town, an unlikely tale of redemption that served as a reminder of the town's values and their ability to inspire change in even the most seemingly irredeemable people. Yet the impact of that infamous courtroom showdown reached far beyond Richard and the immediate community. It became a cornerstone of the town's collective memory, shaping its future and leaving an indelible mark on its people, their values, and even its laws. The town itself transformed in subtle yet profound ways in the years following Richard's journey. The renewed sense of unity that had been born in the aftermath of the courtroom incident continued to strengthen. Under the guidance of Judge Maya Brooks and other community leaders, the town began implementing policies that protected local businesses, preserved cultural heritage, and prioritized community welfare over profit. These policies became a shield against outside corporations that had previously sought to exploit the town, helping to preserve the unique character and spirit of the place. New businesses were encouraged to operate with respect for local customs, and community-centered values were placed at the forefront of any economic decision. Judge Maya Brooks remained at the heart of this transformation, her role expanding from a respected legal figure to something of a moral compass for the town. Her courtroom was no longer just a place where cases were decided. It had become a beacon of integrity and justice. People from neighboring towns came to see her work, often leaving inspired by her wisdom and fair-mindedness. Maya was humble about her role, always emphasizing that she was simply doing her job, but everyone knew she was much more than that. To them, she was a protector, a guiding force who had reminded them all of the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. In the legal world, Maya's influence was also growing. She was invited to speak at conferences, give lectures at law schools, and participate in panels on judicial ethics and community-centered justice. Her approach was seen as groundbreaking, not because it introduced new legal theories, but because it reinforced the importance of humanity in law. At one conference, she spoke passionately about the power of empathy in the legal system, using Richard's transformation as an example of what could happen when judges and lawyers viewed defendants, not as cases to be won or lost, but as people with the capacity for growth and change. Her words resonated widely, sparking a movement among young lawyers who admired her commitment to fairness and integrity. They saw her not only as a role model, but as a beacon of hope for what the justice system could be. Back in the town, the impact of her influence continued to grow. The young people who had witnessed Richard's transformation took his story to heart, understanding it as both a cautionary tale and a lesson in humility. Local schools incorporated the story into their curriculum, framing it as a modern-day parable of the dangers of arrogance and the redemptive power of humility. Students discussed the nuances of the case, analyzed Maya's actions, and reflected on the importance of empathy and respect in their own lives. The story became a symbol of the town's spirit, a reminder that people could change if given the chance, and that justice, at its best, was not about punishment, but about fostering growth. One young man in particular, Jamal, was deeply affected by the tale. He was only 12 when he witnessed the courtroom showdown, and he had looked up to Judge Brooks ever since. Growing up, he had always felt torn between his dreams of making a difference and the challenges he saw his family face. But seeing Maya's influence on the town, watching how she had helped reshape Richard's life, he realized he wanted to pursue a similar path. Inspired by her example, Jamal began working toward a career in law, hoping to someday carry forward her legacy and serve his community in a meaningful way. When he graduated from law school years later, Maya was there to pin his graduation honor, her pride evident as she saw the seeds she had planted take root in the next generation. For Richard, the years had brought a quiet peace and a sense of purpose that he never expected to find. Though he continued to live in the city, he frequently visited the town, volunteering his legal expertise whenever it was needed. He never sought recognition for his efforts. Instead, he worked in the background, assisting families with housing disputes, helping local businesses navigate legal complexities, and offering guidance to young people who had fallen into trouble. He had found a place in the town's ecosystem, a role that allowed him to contribute meaningfully while honoring the values he had learned from Maya, Samuel, and the community. In many ways, he had become a part of the town, even if he didn't officially live there. Richard's life had come full circle. The man who had once been defined by arrogance and privilege was now characterized by humility and service. Those who had been wary of him, who had doubted the sincerity of his transformation, came to respect him. He was never fully embraced as a hero, and he didn't expect to be. But he became someone the town could count on, a reliable presence whose actions spoke louder than any words of contrition could. His story served as a reminder to the community that no one was beyond redemption, and that sometimes people just needed a chance to be better. One evening, many years after the infamous Courtroom case, the town held an event honoring Judge Maya Brooks upon her retirement. The town square was filled with people who had come to celebrate her legacy, and a palpable sense of love and admiration filled the air. There were speeches, stories, and tributes from people whose lives she had touched. Samuel, now older but still as steady as ever, spoke about the quiet courage Maya had shown throughout her career. He recalled the courtroom day that had changed everything, sharing how her actions had given the town the strength to stand up against prejudice and arrogance. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he approached the podium with a humble reverence, his eyes reflecting the journey he had taken because of her. He began by thanking Maya for believing in him when he had given her every reason not to, for showing him that justice was not about victory, but about doing what was right. "I was a man lost in my own ambition," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But Judge Brooks saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Her wisdom, her patience, her belief in second chances, they saved me. I am who I am today because she taught me what it means to be part of a community." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as Richard spoke, his words carrying the weight of his transformation. Maya watched him with a quiet pride, knowing that her years of service had culminated in something profound. She had not only upheld the law but had also inspired a new generation to do the same. The community's applause was overwhelming, an outpouring of gratitude for the woman who had guided them with strength, compassion, and an unwavering sense of justice. As the sun set over the town square, Maya stood surrounded by the people whose lives she had touched, feeling the depth of the legacy she was leaving behind. She had dedicated her life to this town, and as she looked into the faces of the young lawyers, the students, the families, and even those like Richard who had once been lost, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her work was done, but her influence would endure. In the years that followed Maya's retirement, the town continued to grow, yet it never lost the essence of what she had instilled in it. The courthouse remained a symbol of fairness and integrity, a place where all were welcome and where justice was truly blind. The new generation of leaders, inspired by Maya's example, carried her values forward, ensuring that the town's legacy of unity and respect endured. As for Richard, he continued to serve quietly, mentoring young people, sharing his story, and reminding others that transformation was always possible. He knew that he would never fully atone for his past, but he found peace in the fact that he could spend the rest of his life trying. And every time he visited the town, he felt a quiet joy, knowing that he was a part of something greater than himself, a community that had once shown him the way to redemption. Maya's story became a part of the town's history, a legacy of strength and compassion that would inspire future generations. Her impact was woven into the very fabric of the community, a reminder that justice, at its best, is both powerful and kind. And as the town moved forward, it carried with it the lessons of her life, ensuring that her spirit, her wisdom, and her courage would live on forever.